From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren Tal of the Trandosh Empire, I still remember the weight of that moment, standing before the crystalline holocron as it established connection with Earth. The fate of my entire civilization rested upon what I would say next. Behind me, the Grand Archive's central dome stretched upward, its intricate light pipes casting rainbow patterns across my formal robes, patterns that inspired poets for 10,000 years, patterns that the Fornith Collective would destroy without a second thought. The human appeared on the display. Even through the holocron, I could sense something in his bearing that spoke of authority earned through hardship. Ambassador Scott Hayes, they said he was, though I would later learn he had once been General Hayes, until the Perseus War claimed too many of his soldiers. Now he fought with words instead of weapons, trying to prevent conflicts before they began. Honorable representatives of Earth, I began, my translator struggling to maintain composure as my secondary voice bladder quivered with emotion. I come before you representing the Trandosh Empire, a civilization that stands upon the brink of extinction. I had prepared statistics, military reports, strategic analyses of our declining defenses against the Fornith's relentless advance. Hayes raised a hand, stopping me before I could present any of them. There was something in his eyes, a recognition of the weight behind my words that went beyond mere diplomacy. "Tell me about this building you're transmitting from," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made even generals pause. The request caught me off guard. I had chosen the Grand Archive as a symbol of our authority, yes, but no other species had ever. I composed myself and began to explain. This is the Grand Archive of Trandosh Prime. Construction began 8,000 years ago when Show me, he interrupted. Not rudely, but with an intensity that brooked no argument. I would later learn that this was the soldier in him, evaluating not just what he could save, but what would be lost if he failed. For the next 3 days, I guided human observers through every level of our civilization's greatest repository of knowledge and art. They wanted to see everything, the harmonic gardens where our sound sculptors spent decades growing crystal formations through precise sonic resonance, the memory wells where our historians stored their consciousness imprints for future generations, the living murals where specially engineered chromatic bacteria told stories through their colonial patterns. They asked about our educational systems, our artistic traditions, our philosophical debates. Not once did they inquire about our military capability or strategic resources. But I noticed Hayes paying particular attention to the War Memorial Gallery, where we honored those who had died defending our culture through the millennia. His expression, as he studied the eternal flame that burned for our fallen, spoke of personal understanding. On the 4th day, Hayes appeared on the holocron again. The diplomatic facade had fallen away. In its place was the look of a man who had seen too many good things destroyed, too many lives lost, and who had decided, never again. "We have reviewed your civilization's archives," he said, his voice carrying echoes of command that his ambassadorial title couldn't quite hide. "We will help you." I began to thank him, but he continued speaking. "The Fornith Collective will learn that there are consequences to attempting to destroy 10 millennia of art and culture. Prepare your people, High Emissary. Humanity is going to war." That was when I first understood they hadn't spent 3 days assessing if we were worth saving. They had spent 3 days cataloging everything the Fornith had tried to destroy, building a list of crimes that would need to be answered for. The humans were coming not just to save us, but to make sure this could never happen again. And in Hayes' eyes, I saw both the diplomat, who sought peace, and the general, who knew exactly what achieving that peace would cost. From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren Tal of the Trandosh Empire, it was on the final day of the archive tours when Ambassador Hayes asked me the question that would haunt my thoughts for years to come. We stood in the Chamber of Remembrance, surrounded by the whisper-thin crystal sheets that held images of every world the Fornith had taken from us. 15 colonies, each with their own unique artistic traditions, reduced to radioactive ash. Hayes had been quiet that day, more so than usual. He moved through the chamber like a man walking through a graveyard, pausing at each display, studying the images of what had been lost. His hand kept straying to something in his pocket. I would later learn it was an old holotag, bearing the names of soldiers lost under his command during the Perseus War. "High Emissary," he said finally, turning to face me. "If someone tried to burn down the Louvre, what would you do to them?" I blinked all 4 of my eyes in succession, a gesture of confusion that my species uses when presented with an unfamiliar concept. "I don't understand the reference, Ambassador." He smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that old warriors wear when they're remembering something painful. The Louvre is one of Earth's greatest museums. It houses some of our most precious artistic and cultural treasures: paintings, sculptures, artifacts spanning thousands of years of human history. He stepped closer to one of the crystal sheets, where an image of the great Sonic Cathedral of Trandosh Colony 7 hung frozen in time, captured just days before the Fornith reduced it to atoms. During one of humanity's greatest conflicts, we had soldiers who risked their lives, and sometimes died, to protect artwork from destruction or theft. Not military targets, not strategic resources. Art. He turned back to me, because they understood that when you destroy a people's cultural heritage, you're not just destroying objects. You're trying to erase their very existence from the universe. I began to understand then why he had insisted on seeing our archives first, why the humans had spent so much time documenting our artistic achievements, our cultural heritage, our historical records. "But you haven't answered my question, Ambassador," he continued, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. "What would you do to someone who tried to burn down the Louvre?" I looked at the crystal sheets around us, each one a testament to something beautiful that the Fornith had destroyed. I thought about the harmonic gardens, the memory wells, the living murals, all the things they would destroy if they reached our homeworld. "I would stop them," I said finally. "By any means necessary." Hayes nodded, and for a moment I saw the general he had once been. Exactly. And if they had already burned down a dozen other museums? If their entire culture was built around destroying anything beautiful they found? I didn't have to answer. We both knew what he was really asking. This wasn't about a hypothetical museum on Earth. This was about what humanity was preparing to do to the Fornith Collective. "I didn't leave the military because I was afraid of fighting, High Emissary," he said quietly. "I left because I was tired of fighting wars that could have been prevented. But sometimes," he touched one of the crystal sheets gently, "sometimes prevention means stopping the arsonists before they can burn down any more museums." I didn't understand the full implications of his words that day. I would soon enough. From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren Tal of the Trandosh Empire. They arrived in 7 days. I remember standing on the observation deck of the Trandosh Defense Command, watching our long-range sensors track the human fleet's arrival. Ambassador Hayes stood beside me, his posture military straight despite his diplomatic credentials. He'd insisted on being present for what he called the opening moves. The Fornith Doom Fleet hung in high orbit around Sentinel Colony, our last remaining outer world. 300 capital ships that had brought ruin to a dozen of our worlds. Our tactical analysts had estimated it would take a force 5 times that size to challenge them. The human fleet numbered only 50 ships. "Ambassador," I began carefully, "while we appreciate humanity's swift response, perhaps we should wait for reinforcements. The Fornith Doomfleet has never been defeated in direct combat, and your numbers," Hayes interrupted softly, "are not always the deciding factor in war, High Emissary." He was looking at the tactical display with the practiced eye of a veteran. "Sometimes it's about having the right tools for the job." The first shot of the battle was fired at 0743 Standard Time. We didn't even see it happen. One moment, the Fornith flagship was there. The next, reality itself seemed to bend around it, and the ship simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no debris, just gone. The Fornith response was immediate and predictable. They launched their infamous darkwave attack, the same maneuver that had spelled doom for so many of our own fleets. A ripple of gravitational distortions that would tear apart anything in its path. The human ships danced. There's no other word for it. They moved in ways that defied our understanding of physics, slipping between the gravitational waves like water through a net. Their formations spiraled and twisted in 3-dimensional patterns that seemed random at first, until I realized they were herding the Fornith fleet into a precise configuration. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Hayes murmured. He was watching the battle with an expression I'd seen on our master sound sculptors when observing a particularly complex resonance pattern. Admiral Hubbard always did have an artistic touch to his fleet maneuvers. The main assault, when it came, lasted exactly 6 minutes and 23 seconds. Human ships simply appeared inside the Fornith formation, their weapons cycling through frequencies we'd never seen before. Ships that had shrugged off our strongest attacks for decades simply came apart, their supposedly impenetrable shields useless against whatever the humans were using. How I started to ask, but Hayes held up a hand. The Fornith based their entire military doctrine on being the strongest force in known space, he said quietly. They never considered that someone might have been holding back. Humanity learned long ago that showing your full capabilities often leads to unnecessary conflicts. We prefer to keep certain advantages in reserve. The battle, if it could even be called that, was over in less than 6 hours. The mighty Doom Fleet, terror of the outer colonies, had been reduced to scattered atoms. Not a single human ship was lost. As the sensor displays cleared, Hayes turned to me. The diplomat was gone again, replaced by the general who had seen too many wars. "Send word to your people," he said. "Let them know that the Fornith will never threaten another colony." "You sound very certain of that," I observed. His smile was cold. "Because this wasn't a battle, High Emissary. This was a demonstration. The Fornith needed to understand exactly what they're dealing with before we begin the next phase. The next phase. The part where we ensure they can never do this again." He looked back at the tactical display, where the last traces of the Doom Fleet were fading from our sensors. Sometimes winning the battle isn't enough. Sometimes you have to win the peace that follows. I would soon learn exactly what he meant by that. From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren Tal of the Trandosh Empire, the Fornith's Supreme Command's surrender came 3 days after Admiral Hubbard's fleet reduced their Doom Fleet to scattered atoms. I was present in the command center when their transmission arrived, standing alongside Ambassador Hayes as the message was decoded. The Supreme Commander of the Fornith himself appeared on our screens. Even through the alien features, I could see the shock, the disbelief. Their species had never known defeat. They had no protocols for surrender. We, the Supreme Commander's translation matrix, struggled with the unfamiliar concepts. "We submit to terms of cessation. Our remaining forces will stand down. We ask for diplomatic dialogue to discuss reparations and acknowledged." Admiral Hubbard's voice cut through the transmission. His hologram appeared beside the Fornith leaders, his weathered face set in stone. "Your surrender is noted. Be advised that military operations will continue as planned." The Supreme Commander's feeding tendrils twisted in confusion. "Perhaps there is an error in translation. We are surrendering. By all established conventions of warfare, this stopped being about conventional warfare." Hubbard interrupted. "The moment you made genocide your standard operating procedure." He turned slightly, nodding to Hayes, who stepped forward. I had never seen the ambassador look more like the general he once was than in that moment. "Supreme Commander," Hayes said, his voice carrying that quiet authority that I had come to recognize as far more dangerous than any show of anger. "Let me be perfectly clear. This is not a negotiation. This is not a discussion of terms. This is us informing you of what happens next. But we surrender." The Supreme Commander's translator couldn't quite capture the incredulity in his harmonic tones, but his body language spoke volumes. "In civilized space, when an enemy surrenders." "Civilized?" Hayes didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made everyone in the command center flinch. "You forfeit any claim to civilization when you made it your mission to erase other cultures from existence. Admiral Hubbard's fleet just demonstrated what happens to your military forces. Now you get to see what happens to cultures that think genocide is an acceptable policy." I found myself speaking up, my diplomatic training overriding my better judgment. "Ambassador, surely now that they've surrendered, we can begin the peace process." Hayes turned to me. And in his eyes I saw not just the general who had lost too many soldiers, but a human who had clearly seen this scenario play out before in their own history. "High Emissary," he said quietly, "you're thinking of this as a war that needs to end. We're thinking of this as a cancer that needs to be excised." He turned back to the Fornith leader. "Your surrender is acknowledged because it means we won't have to kill any more of your soldiers. But make no mistake, we're not done. Not by a long shot. What are you planning to do?" The Supreme Commander's translator crackled with barely contained fear. Admiral Hubbard's response was chilling in its simplicity. "We're going to make sure you never threaten another civilization again. How much that hurts depends entirely on how much you resist." As the transmission ended, I looked at Hayes. "This isn't how war works in civilized space," I protested weakly. His smile was grim. "No, High Emissary. This isn't war anymore." He gestured to the tactical displays showing human ships moving into position around key Fornith worlds. "This is pest control. And humanity has gotten very, very good at it." Looking at those displays, watching the methodical deployment of human forces, I realized that the Fornith's surrender hadn't ended anything. It had simply marked the beginning of something else entirely. From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren Tal of the Trandosh Empire, they called it Operation Clean Slate. I watched it unfold over the next 3 months with a mixture of awe and horror. The humans approached the dismantling of the Fornith war machine with the same methodical precision that Admiral Hubbard had shown in destroying their fleet. "It's like watching surgeons remove a tumor," Hayes commented one day as we observed the tactical feeds. He had taken to providing me with regular briefings, though I suspected it was more to help me understand the necessity of their actions than any diplomatic requirement. The humans' definition of military capability proved to be far more comprehensive than anyone had anticipated. They didn't just target the obvious facilities, the weapon factories, the shipyards, the training academies. They went after everything that could potentially support military action: mining operations that could provide materials for warships, dismantled or placed under human control, research facilities studying particle physics, thoroughly audited and restricted, manufacturing centers capable of producing precision tools, completely repurposed. I watched as a human team methodically took apart the largest shipyard in the Fornith Collective. They didn't destroy it. That would have been simpler. Instead, they rebuilt it, piece by piece, into a facility that could only construct civilian vessels. The precision of their restrictions was breathtaking. But how will they defend themselves? I asked Hayes as we watched another weapons facility being systematically deconstructed. Surely they need some military capability for basic planetary defense. Hayes was studying a report on his datapad, something about converting a former military academy into a civilian university. "They'll be defended," he said without looking up. "By us. You're going to protect them. After everything they've done." Now he did look up, and I saw that familiar mix of the diplomat and the general in his expression. "We're going to protect everyone else from them. The fact that this also protects them from external threats is incidental." The Fornith leadership protested, of course. They cited ancient rights, sovereign privileges, the need for self-determination. Admiral Hubbard's response became somewhat famous among the observation teams. "Self-determination is a right you forfeit when you try to determine that other species shouldn't exist." But it was during a private dinner with Hayes that I finally understood the full scope of their intentions. He was picking at his food, something he called meatloaf that his staff had attempted to recreate for him, when I brought up the latest protests from the Fornith. "They're saying you're destroying their civilization," I said. Hayes set down his fork. "Do you know what happens to a reformed criminal on Earth, High Emissary?" The apparent non sequitur caught me off guard. "I don't follow. They're monitored. Their access to certain things is restricted. They have to prove they can be trusted with basic privileges that others take for granted." He smiled grimly. "We're not destroying their civilization. We're putting it on parole. And how long will this parole last?" He looked out the viewport at the Fornith homeworld below. Teams of human ships moved in precise patterns, continuing their methodical work. "That depends entirely on them," he said quietly. "But I suspect it will take at least a generation before they understand why this is happening. Another generation before they actually change. And perhaps one more before we can trust that change is genuine. 3 generations of occupation. No," his voice was firm. 3 generations of rehabilitation. There's a difference." He turned back to me. "We're being merciful, High Emissary. We're giving them a chance to become something better than what they are. And if they were not surrendered, if they had fought to the end," his expression darkened, "then there wouldn't be any generations to rehabilitate." I realized then that the Fornith's surrender hadn't saved them from punishment. It had simply given them the opportunity to survive what was coming next. From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren Tal of the Trandosh Empire, the first time I entered the Fornith Central Archives, I wasn't prepared for what we would find. The humans had insisted on a joint archaeological team, their scientists working alongside representatives from every species the Fornith had attacked. I was there to represent the Trandosh Empire's interests. Ambassador Hayes accompanied us personally. "History isn't just written by the victors," he told me as we walked through the vast underground complex. "Sometimes it's written by the perpetrators themselves. They just never expect anyone to read it." The Fornith hadn't bothered to destroy their records. Why would they? They had never conceived of defeat. Their archives were immaculate, clinical, and damning. 12 species. 12 civilizations before they reached the Trandosh Empire. Each one meticulously documented, their destruction planned with the same attention to detail that we Trandosh put into our artistic endeavors. The humans had known, or at least suspected, but seeing the evidence firsthand was different. The luminous chuar of the Zentari, Hayes read from one display, his translation matrix struggling with the ancient names. A species that communicated through bioluminescent patterns. Their entire culture was built around the interpretation of light and color. He paused, his expression hardening. Current status extinct. Last specimen terminated in the year of glory, 3549. The archives went on. The crystal shapers of Meridian, the song weavers of the deltoid reach, the living art of the helix worlds. Each one a unique cultural treasure, each one methodically erased from existence. But it was their educational materials that truly horrified us. The Fornith didn't just destroy other cultures, they celebrated it. Their children were taught that the extinction of lesser races was a sacred duty. Their art galleries were filled with representations of worlds burning, species dying. Their victory monuments were built from the recycled remains of their victims' cultural artifacts. Look at these lesson plans, one of the human archaeologists called out. They're teaching orbital bombardment calculations using the destruction of the Zentari homeworld as a practical example. Hayes stood before a massive display showing the triumph calendar, a chronological record of their genocides. His face was a mask of contained fury, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Now you understand, he said quietly. This isn't just about punishment. It's not even about justice. It's about survival, the survival of the very concept of cultural diversity in our galaxy. I moved to another terminal, accessing records of their first contact protocols. Everything was categorized by potential threat level, not military threat, but cultural threat. Species with rich artistic traditions were marked for immediate elimination. Those with limited cultural development were designated for later attention. They were saving us for last, I realized, my secondary voice bladder trembling. Among all the species they'd encountered, we Trandosh had the longest continuous artistic tradition. They were savoring it. Hayes nodded grimly, like a predator saving the biggest prey for last. But they made a mistake. He turned to me, and I saw that steel in his eyes again. They waited too long. Long enough for you to find us. One of the human archaeologists called us over to another terminal. This one contained philosophical treatises, the foundational documents of Fornith society. Their core belief was simple and horrifying, that the universe itself was diminished by diversity, that true perfection could only be achieved through uniformity. They saw themselves not as destroyers, but as purifiers. In a way, we're proving their philosophy wrong with their own history, Hayes observed. Their records of the civilizations they destroyed, these will become teaching tools. Every culture they erased will be remembered, studied, honored. Their own meticulous documentation will ensure that nothing is forgotten. As we prepared to leave the archives that day, Hayes paused at the entrance. You know what the real irony is? He asked, looking back at the vast repository of genocide. In trying to enforce their vision of cultural purity, they created something unique themselves, a perfect record of why such purity should never be allowed to exist. I understood then why the humans had insisted on seeing our archives first, before agreeing to help us. They hadn't just been evaluating what was at risk, they had been confirming that we were worth saving, that we weren't like the Fornith. The humans hadn't just prevented our extinction. They had stopped a darkness that had been spreading through our galaxy for millennia, and they weren't finished yet. From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren Tal of the Trandosh Empire, the invitation to dine privately with Ambassador Hayes came 6 months into the occupation, or rehabilitation, as the humans insisted on calling it. His quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel were sparse, military in their efficiency, with one notable exception. The walls were covered in reproductions of artwork from various species, including several pieces from the extinct civilizations we discovered in the Fornith archives. Replicas, he explained, catching my gaze on a luminescent pattern that could only have come from the lost Centauri, created from the Fornith's documentation. Humanity's best artists worked to recreate them. Not perfect, but he touched the frame gently, a reminder of what we're fighting to prevent. The meal was simple. Hayes had developed a fondness for Trandosh cuisine, particularly our mineral-infused broths. We ate in silence for a while before I finally voiced the question that had been troubling me. You think we're being cruel, he said, before I could even finish. The forced rehabilitation, the cultural reprogramming, the generational oversight. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted. They did surrender, after all. Hayes set down his spoon and leaned back, his expression distant. Let me tell you about World War II, he began. A conflict from humanity's past. Before that war, there was another, the First World War. When it ended, the victors accepted their enemies' surrender, imposed some reparations, and essentially trusted them to behave better in the future. He stood and walked to a virtual window showing the Fornith homeworld below. 20 years later, those same enemies had rebuilt their military might and plunged the world into an even more devastating conflict. They had industrialized genocide, turned mass murder into an assembly line process. When we finally defeated them the second time, we didn't just accept their surrender. We occupied their country. We rewrote their laws. We reformed their education system. We restructured their entire society. And now, I asked, now they're one of Earth's strongest allies and most vibrant democracies. He turned back to me. But it took a generation. A full generation of occupation, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. Sometimes, mercy to the aggressor is cruelty to their future victims. I chittered in disagreement, a sound my translator rendered as a skeptical hum. But surely there's a difference between reformation and what we're doing to the Fornith. Is there? Hayes returned to his seat. The Fornith didn't just commit genocide, they built their entire civilization around it. Their children learn orbital bombardment calculations using real extinction events as mathematics exercises. Their art celebrates the destruction of other cultures. Their philosophy teaches that diversity itself is a flaw in the universe that must be corrected. He picked up his spoon again, stirring the cooling broth. If we simply accepted their surrender and left them to their own devices, how long before they rebuilt? How many more species would die before someone stopped them again? But 3 generations of oversight. At minimum, he said firmly. The first generation will hate us, resist us at every turn. The second generation will begin to understand why we did this, but they'll still carry the echoes of their parents' hatred. It's the third generation, the ones who grow up learning about art and music instead of genocide calculations, who see the beauty in diversity instead of a flaw to be corrected. They're the ones who will truly change. I considered this as I finished my own broth. And you believe this will work? Hayes smiled. But it wasn't a happy expression. It has to. Because the alternative, he gestured to the Zentari artwork on his wall, is letting this happen again. And humanity has seen enough genocides in its own history to know better. Your species seems to have learned harsh lessons from its past, I observed. The harshest. He stood and walked to a small cabinet, removing an old, worn book, an actual physical book, its pages yellowed with age. After World War II, humanity said never again. We meant it then, but we failed to prevent several later genocides on our own world. Each time we learned more about what it takes to truly prevent such horrors. He set the book on the table between us. Now we have the power to enforce never again on a galactic scale, and we will not fail again. I looked at the book. Its title was in English, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Required reading, Hayes said quietly, for anyone who wants to understand why we're being so thorough with the Fornith rehabilitation. As I left his quarters that night, I realized that humanity's apparent cruelty masked a deeper kindness, one that looked not just to the present, but centuries into the future. They were being harsh now to prevent unimaginable horrors later. The true question was, would the galaxy understand this before or after the rehabilitation was complete? From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren, Tal of the Trandosh Empire 1 year, into what the humans called their cultural rehabilitation program, I was invited to tour one of the converted military academies on the Fornith homeworld. The change was stark. Where once there had been parade grounds for martial demonstrations, there now stood an open-air amphitheater. The weapons training facilities had been transformed into art studios and music halls. Ambassador Hayes walked beside me, occasionally stopping to observe classes in session. In one room, young Fornith were learning about the artistic traditions of the very species their parents had helped destroy. The instructor, a human expert in xenoanthropology, was teaching them about Zentari light poetry. "Watch this," Hayes said quietly. The instructor dimmed the lights and activated a reconstructed Zentari luminescence pattern. The young Fornith's feeding tendrils writhed in what I had learned was an expression of wonder. One of them raised an appendage. "Yes, Kellner?" the instructor asked. The pattern, it's telling a story about star death and renewal. But the color shifts suggest an underlying theme of cultural preservation through memory. Hayes smiled. That student's father was a fleet commander who participated in 3 extinction campaigns. Now his child is learning to appreciate the very art forms his father tried to destroy. This is how change begins. We move through the facility. Every classroom, every hall, Every gathering space had been carefully designed to expose the Fornith to the cultures they had previously sought to eradicate. But it wasn't just about the past. The humans had brought in artists, musicians, and scholars from dozens of species to teach and collaborate. The key, Hayes explained as we watched a mixed group of Fornith and Trandosh youth working on a joint sonic sculpture project, is not to simply force them to memorize what was lost. We need them to create something new, to understand that diversity doesn't weaken the universe, it enriches it. Admiral Hubbard joined us later in the tour. He had taken a personal interest in the rehabilitation program, often advising on its security aspects. The first generation is the hardest, he noted, watching a group of adult Fornith in what the humans called a cultural sensitivity workshop. They still remember the old ways, still believe in them, many of them. But their children, he gestured to another classroom, where young Fornith were learning traditional Trandosh harmony weaving. Their children will grow up knowing something different. And their children's children won't be able to imagine it any other way. And the parents, I asked. The ones who still cling to the old beliefs? Hayes's expression hardened slightly. They're free to believe what they want. But the moment they try to act on those beliefs, he left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. The humans had established what they called cultural centers in every major Fornith city. These weren't just museums or libraries, they were living monuments to the species the Fornith had destroyed. Each center was staffed by historians and artists from various species, including humans who had specialized in reconstructing lost art forms. We're not just teaching them about what they destroyed, Hayes explained as we toured one such center. We're making them part of the preservation effort. Every piece of art they help reconstruct, every song they help recreate, every story they help preserve. It's a step toward redemption. The centerpiece of each facility was what the humans called the Hall of Memory, a vast chamber where reconstructions of lost cultural artifacts were displayed alongside the stories of their creation and destruction. But it wasn't just a memorial to what was lost. Next to each piece was space for new works inspired by the old, created by Fornith artists engaging with the cultures they had once sought to erase. Look at this, Hayes said, stopping before a particular display. A young Fornith artist had created a piece that combined traditional Fornith crystalline architecture with Zentari light patterns. This is what we're working toward. Not just preservation, but evolution. New art forms born from the intersection of cultures that were never allowed to meet peacefully before. As we concluded our tour, I noticed something remarkable. The military precision that had once defined Fornith society was being redirected. The same attention to detail that had made them terrifyingly efficient destroyers was now being applied to the preservation and creation of art. They're still who they are, Hayes observed, noting my reaction. We're not trying to fundamentally change their nature. We're just giving them a different purpose. The same drive for perfection, but in service of creation rather than destruction. I looked back at the cultural center, at the mixed groups of species working together on various projects. And you believe this will be enough? Hayes watched a young Fornith carefully documenting a recovered piece of Helix World poetry. It has to be. Because the alternative, he touched a nearby display showing the ruins of a Zentari temple. The alternative is making sure there's nothing left to preserve at all. The message was clear. The humans weren't just punishing the Fornith. They were giving them a chance to be part of something greater than destruction. Whether they would take that chance remained to be seen. From the personal logs of High Emissary Kren, Tal of the Trandosh Empire. A century has passed since humanity refused to accept the Fornith's surrender. I am old now, my scales dulled with age, but I remain Earth's primary diplomatic contact. Ambassador Hayes retired long ago, though we still correspond. His grandson now serves as part of the Oversight Committee for the Fornith Rehabilitation Program. The Fornith Collective is different now. Their cities, once uniform monuments to militant order, have bloomed into diverse expressions of art and culture. Their once dreaded shipyards now produce exploration vessels and mobile cultural exhibitions. Their children learn mathematics through music theory instead of orbital bombardment calculations. Last week, I attended the opening of their newest cultural center. The building itself was a testament to change, a fusion of architectural styles from a dozen different species, including elements from cultures the Fornith had once destroyed. The main exhibition was what truly moved me, though. A collection of intricate glass sculptures created by Fornith artisans, each piece a memorial to one of the species their ancestors had tried to erase from existence. The lead artist was the granddaughter of the former Supreme Commander, the the same one who had offered that desperate surrender a century ago. She gave a speech that I wish Hayes could have heard in person. "We carry the weight of our history," she said, her translator rendering her words with perfect clarity. "But we also carry the responsibility to create rather than destroy, to preserve rather than erase, to add our voice to the galaxy's great chorus rather than try to silence others. This is our redemption, earned one piece of art at a time." The human's oversight continues, though its nature has evolved. The third generation that Hayes spoke of has indeed proven different from their grandparents. They see the beauty and diversity that their ancestors tried so hard to eliminate. They study the records of their past atrocities not with pride, but with a solemn determination to never repeat those mistakes. Some say the humans were cruel in their methods, that accepting the Fornith's surrender but continuing their operations was a violation of galactic law, that 3 generations of cultural rehabilitation was too harsh a punishment. But I have lived long enough to see the results. The Forniths still exist as a species in a culture, something they never allowed their own victims. Their society has been transformed not through extinction but through education. Their fierce dedication to perfection, once turned toward destruction, now drives them to create works of stunning beauty. In my office at the Trandosh Embassy on Earth, I keep 2 items side by side: a piece of art from the first Fornith cultural exhibition and a framed human phrase that Hayes gave me before his retirement. The art is a crystalline structure that captures and refracts light in a way that mimics Centauri light poetry, a memorial and an evolution in one piece. The phrase reads, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The humans did not do nothing. They did not accept a simple surrender that would have allowed the cancer of genocide to merely go dormant. They chose the harder path, the longer path, of genuine rehabilitation. Admiral Hubbard once told me, "Sometimes victory isn't about destroying your enemy. Sometimes it's about making sure they never want to be your enemy again." Looking at the Fornith Collective today, at their art galleries where weapons factories once stood, at their children learning songs instead of war chants, at their scientists studying cultural preservation instead of orbital bombardment, I understand what he meant. The humans didn't just save my species from extinction. They didn't just stop a force of destruction that had plagued our galaxy for millennia. They did something far more difficult. They taught the destroyers how to create. When asked if they regret the harshness of their methods, most human oversight officials give the same response: look at their art galleries, not their military records. That's your answer. I am old now, and I have seen enough of history to know this truth. Sometimes, refusing a surrender is the greatest mercy of all. End log. Final entry in the personal records of High Emissary Clarke Tal of the Trandosh Empire. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.